I've done a little bit of preparation here, so you can see that little pink square. Just to ignore it for now, and I'll explain more later. I'm using rough 300 grams paper, and I've used some washi tape to divide the paper up into 6 squares to demonstrate these different techniques. I'm actually wetting the paper here with my size 10 brush, and I'm going to drop watercolour paint in here. You can try any different sort of colours that you fancy, but just dropping colours in wet, just on top of ordinary tap water there, just to see what happens. And as you can see, the paint sort of runs and you've got a lovely soft edge. And it's quite fun to do, and it's a great technique to use in watercolour painting, creating lots of amazing effects. The reason why I'm showing you wet here is because I'm going to show you what happens when you add salt to water and use that salty water to wet your paper. I'm using just ordinary table salt, and that's the little white cup to the left there, and to the right of it I'm using Himalayan salt. So you can experiment with different salts. It's really good fun. As you can see, I just painted some really creamy darks into the center of those blues there, working damp into damp. So I'm starting off with the Himalayan salt. It's got a pink shade, as you can see there in the little cup, and I'm wetting the surface of the paper there with my size 14 brush, really covering the paper with all this water here, trying to get an even amount of water so there's no puddles there. So sort of really letting the water, salty water, soak into the paper. So giving it a little bit of time there. What I'm doing now is I've swapped to my size 10 brush, and I'm just dropping now wet into wet, as I did previously when I wet the left hand little square there with just ordinary tap water. You can see the difference already. They're more circular and they sort of spread more evenly. They almost look like flowers there. It's quite a beautiful sort of technique. I've just thickened up the paint here a little and used a slightly different cooler blue there, so it's more of a violet blue at the top there. I'm just playing around really with the colours in my palette, so don't worry particularly about what colours I'm doing. I really encourage you all to have a little experiment, but you can see there you get a sort of more of a definite sort of round shape there. And now I'm using thicker, creamier paint here, but a bit of violet, and painting this damp into damp with the tip of my brush there, just to see what happens. It's such fun to experiment. Haven't actually used salty water before. I've always used salt and sprinkled it straight onto the paper, so it's been fun to find out about this a little bit more as well. So next I'm using some of the table salt. So I've rinsed off all of the Himalayan salt. I'm just comparing the difference there. I'm wetting the paper, and I've used about 1/4 teaspoon of salt in each of these little cups here as well. So you can sort of change the quantity, and I think it actually changes the result slightly as well. So I'm just wetting the paper carefully here, really just allowing all the water to soak into the paper and not making sure there are no puddles there. And so just making that really nice and even, getting rid of the puddles at the edges there, and just dropping now in, just with the tip of my brush, wet into wet, some of this blue with a touch of violet here. And as you can see again, it sort of explodes out a little bit. It's lovely, and it leaves that dark in the middle, as it did with the wet in wet on the ordinary tap water, but you get an even sort of roundness around the edges there. And I'm just thinking of all these different things I could use it for. Definitely wildflowers and flowers, and you know, just experimenting, playing around with this. I've just changed to a slightly creamier, darker colour here, with added a bit more violet. So painting damp into wet and just really experimenting here, having a bit of fun, just seeing what happens. The sort of salt sort of gives it a sort of a different sort of effect there, and sort of allows the paint to really travel as well. So I'm adding a little bit of cobalt violet into the centres as well, just to see what happens. Thinking again, this will be really nice for flower paintings, which I love to do. So here's a close-up here. The paintings haven't dried yet, but I really like the Himalayan salt in the centre there. I love the effect it has created there, and also a little bit of the table salt as well. So I'll look at those later once they're dry. I thought I'd demonstrate to you how I use salt, how I teach my students, etc., but also troubleshoot the reasons why your salt may not be working. So I'm just just painting some violet here, wet on wet, onto the rough watercolour paper with my size 10 brush. I'm deliberately now making this top part really, really wet because I want to show you the sort of different ways or different times you can apply salt. So you can apply salt when your painting is full of puddles. I wouldn't recommend it, but I thought I'd demonstrate it. So I've got a really wet paint at the top there, and I'm going to apply some table salt. I'm just taking a little pinch of that and sprinkling it evenly onto the very wet puddle there. I'm going to do the same with the Himalayan salt on the right hand side into the puddle there. I'm just going to allow that to dry naturally. Meanwhile, I want the center of this wash now for the shine to go off a little bit, so it's damp, and I'm going to sprinkle some salt onto the damp surface, which is the time I would recommend students to apply it. So I've applied table salt on the left and the Himalayan salt on the right as I'm doing there. I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. As you can see, it's drying off now and the paper is still damp, so I'm actually putting some table salt on the left and some Himalayan salt on the right, and I'm going to allow them to dry naturally, which could take several hours. So at the top it's very wet, in the middle it's damp, and at the bottom it's drying off. So I'm rubbing off with my paper towel. Sometimes the salt sticks, so I would advise using the bottom of a tube of paint and gently sort of scrape off the salt so it doesn't scratch your paper or damage the paper in any sort of way, and then brush off the remaining salt. So here is the painting dried, and you can see the difference at the top there. The salt's exploded literally, and it's not got a lot of shape. In the middle it's got better shape, especially the Himalayan salt on the right hand side. I'm quite pleased with the salt on the bottom left. That was the table salt. The Himalayan salt didn't work quite well on the right hand side, so it's quite interesting the different effects you get from different types of salt, but also the different times that you put them on, when it's very wet or when it's sort of damp or when it's drying off. So I really encourage you to have a little practice. Some of you that are still struggling with salt, one of the main factors can be you might be using low salt, which really doesn't work very well, or you might be in a very humid climate, and I hear that the salt doesn't work very well in humid climates, but I'll be happy to hear otherwise. Also, some watercolour papers don't seem to work well with salt. I'm using Saunders Waterford, I've used Winsor & Newton and Arches, and that works quite well. So it's good to experiment with different watercolour papers as well. So back to this pink square. Why have I got a pink square? Well, it's dry now, and what I'm doing is I'm layering it over with some dark green paint, working wet on dry, really sort of scooping up lots and lots of paint, painting this flat wash right down to the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the salt and sprinkle it on top of the damp paint so that you can see the underpainting coming through when the salt starts to dry. So I'm using the table salt to begin with. Make sure your painting is damp, not too wet as I showed you earlier, and not too dry, and sprinkling the table salt evenly onto the sort of bottom half of the painting here. And now I'm sprinkling the Himalayan salt onto the damp surface on the top part of the painting, just brushing off the residue salt there. I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. And here is the dried painting, and it's gorgeous, isn't it? All those wonderful textures, and I love that pink colour coming through as well, that green paint. I'm really pleased with that, and I hope you're inspired to use this technique in your watercolour painting. Now, for those of you that just don't get on with salt, and I know there are lots of you out there, I'm just going to show you a technique that you can use if you have trouble with salt. So what I'm doing now is I'm just using some cobalt violet and also trying to get rid of a few blobs from that green paint as well. But I'm just painting a flat wash, wet on dry, in this last little square here. My best tip is to be patient, but also be watchful. Because you can miss your opportunity, because you want the sheen to be on the paper. You can still see the sheen is on that wash there. If it starts to go and it fades to a matte sort of look, you've almost missed that opportunity. So you kind of want to get it when it's damp, not too wet, and obviously not too dried off. So I'm just waiting patiently. This is a few minutes later and I'm just checking now. The shine is going a little bit now, so it's a good opportunity to try this technique for those of you that don't get on with salt. So I'm using a bristle brush, which is an old hog hair brush, but you could use a toothbrush or your ordinary watercolour brush and just spatter with it. So what I'm doing now is I'm just getting ordinary tap water, dipping it in there, taking the excess off on my paper towel and just brushing the end of the brush there against my index finger there, spattering tap water onto the damp surface that's nearly sort of drying. So you don't want it too wet, otherwise this won't work too well, and certainly not too dry because it won't work at all. So as you can see there, I've got some lovely textures by spattering the tap water. Now I thought I'd use some of the table salt water, so I'm spattering some of that. I just wanted to compare the difference actually, and this might work for some of you that have trouble with salt as well. So I'm going to do the same with the Himalayan dissolved salt in the water here as well. I just wiped off the excess there on the paper towel to get a little bit of control on the spattering, and I'm just spattering the watered down Himalayan salt there as well. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of table salt just in this little patch here, just a comparison, just to see how everything sort of looks side by side. So this is a close-up. If you look at the little square on the right, the spattering of the tap water isn't bad actually, as is the dissolved Himalayan and table salt. The salt has worked the best, I must say, but as an alternative to salt, spattering tap water is a great alternative, creating both light and texture. So I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and may be inspired to dissolve some salt, use salty water in your watercolour painting and apply your washes onto it wet in wet and see what happens. I also hope you found it useful spattering tap water onto a damp watercolour wash to create some light and textures, helpful especially if you are having trouble with salt. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comment section below and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to my watercolour YouTube channel for updates of my latest tutorials. If you would like to learn more about watercolour painting, why not check out my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found on the screen or in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.